These are some of the most controversial moments from music history. Some we can look back on and laugh, but some we can look back on and see how they changed music forever. Where do you draw the line between being inspired and taking someone's intellectual property? Ask any musician who inspires them and they'll give you a list as long as their arm. And if you listen to their music or their playing, those inspirations will become clear. In the past, the idea of intellectual copyright has been less well defined. For many of the classical composers we think of, there wouldn't have been such a thing as copyright law to protect their work. It's also true in folk music and oral tradition. Music would be passed down and there wouldn't even be such a thing as a composer. But of course, music back then didn't have the reach it has today. And more importantly, it didn't have the commercial value either. Nowadays, of course, copyright law is a well-established idea, and with so much money in music, it's often used not so much because people don't want their idea to be copied, but they don't want to lose out on money. I think the most well-known case is between Ed Sheeran's song Thinking Out Loud and Marvin Gaye's Let's Get It On. Since we got to be here, we'll be loving you till we're 70. There are similarities between the two songs. Most notably, they share the same chord progression, but as Ed Sheeran claimed, these simple chords are just part of the building blocks of music. The case was first filed in 2016, and a verdict wasn't reached until 2023, meaning the case went on for 7 years until the judge ruled in Ed Sheeran's favour. There are so many examples of this kind of thing. Tom Petty and Jeff Lynne, who both wrote Petty's song I Won't Back Down, were able to claim co-writing credit on Sam Smith's Stay With Me. Oh, won't you stay with me? And there are also some cases of songs clearly borrowing too much from another, and the case seems fairer. For example, in my last video about Steely Dan's album Gaucho, the title track is quite clearly inspired by Keith Jarrett's Long As You Know You're Living Yours. Donald Fagen even later admitted he was uncomfortable with it sounding so similar. The idea of protecting intellectual property and using the law to do that, I think is a good idea, but the controversy here is that no one seems to care unless there's lots of money to be made. The chord progression in Let's Get It On has been used hundreds, maybe thousands of times, and suddenly Ed Sheeran writes just another one of these songs, and it makes a load of money, and Marvin Gaye's estate starts claiming that they own the chord progression. In the 1950s, Elvis Presley skyrocketed to fame, thanks in part to the rise of television. Part of his image were his signature dance moves, which included his famous hip shaking, something that was seen as inappropriate to 1950s audiences. The backlash was so intense that networks began filming Elvis primarily from the waist up to avoid showing his dancing. This is really just one of the first examples from the 50s and 60s of youth culture entering popular music and redefining what was acceptable to audiences.
This is not for children's eyes.
In the following years, this went beyond just dancing but into the music itself. Beatles lyrics such as I'd Love to Turn You On or Jim Morrison singing Girl We Couldn't Get Much Higher were seen as inappropriate given their drug connotations. Even the Beach Boys with God Only Knows had to think carefully as to whether it would be wise to release a song with God in the title. In the following years, it became more normalised and accepted for people to use provocative on-stage performing to engage audiences. So too, it helped to establish popular music as a voice for younger audiences. And like with so many other things, controversy only helps to reach a wider audience. It's also given us so much great music, and that wouldn't have been possible if things just always stayed the same.
I guess you guys aren't ready for that yet. But your kids are gonna love it.
Our next controversy is John Lennon with his famous line that they were more popular than Jesus. The exact quote was, "Christianity will go. It will vanish and shrink. I needn't argue about that. I'm right and I'll be proved right. We're more popular than Jesus now. I don't know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity." The comment caused significant backlash, especially in the US, with outraged fans burning Beatles records and memorabilia, and some radio stations refusing to play their music. They received death threats, especially when they toured the US in 1966, and and ultimately John was forced to apologise during a press conference in Chicago.
I just said they are having more influence on kids and things than anything else, including Jesus, but I said it in that way, which is the wrong way. Yeah.
It's often cited as one of the reasons why the Beatles stopped touring to focus on their work in the studio, which led to the most creative period of their career. I think what's interesting about these controversial moments is that they often have consequences that lead to something more interesting than the controversy itself. The Beatles' work from 1966 onwards, so Revolver and later, is really when things started to get experimental. And this music is more remembered and had a much greater impact than John's quote. Part of what makes this so controversial is that what he said was probably true. Youth culture and counterculture in the 60s meant that traditional religious belief was declining, and the Beatles really were more popular than anything. I also think, looking at the full quote, that the more popular than Jesus line isn't the most offensive part. That's just a comment on popular culture. But Christianity will go, it will vanish and shrink, seems to comment on something much more important to society, but no one remembers that line. If there is any type of music that's meant to be upheld with respect and in high esteem, it's the national anthem of a country. And I don't think there is any national anthem that has been subject to as many different interpretations as the USA's Star Spangled Banner. Firstly, this is not a comment on the Star Spangled Banner itself. As national anthems go, I think it's a great piece of music and very powerful as well. And it's a compliment to the USA that it's so widely interpreted. The first popular performance that caused uproar was that by Jose Feliciano. At the height of the protests surrounding the Vietnam War, he was invited to perform at Game 5 of the 1968 World Series.
Oh, see, can you see by the dawn's early light?
The performance was seen as disrespecting to the anthem and was highly damaging to his career, almost ending it. But years later, opinions changed, and it was later released as a single and was actually added to the Baseball Hall of Fame. Perhaps an even more controversial performance was that by Jimi Hendrix. Jimi Hendrix regularly performed it during his concerts during the late 60s, but the most notable, of course, is that at Woodstock. The controversy, of course, comes from the perspective of insulting or denigrating a piece of music that's meant to represent unity and the values of a country. But I think in at least both of these cases, the performances were intended to pay some kind of respect. Hendrix also began his shows with God Save the Queen in a similar style when he performed in the UK. There's something about the Star Spangled Banner that is particularly suited to different interpretations. It's very melodic, actually notably difficult for singers to sing because of its wide range. And it's also more adjacent to the style of a popular song in the way that many national anthems aren't so much. The other side of the coin is that some performances of the Star Spangled Banner are just as unique and memorable, but also simply stunning. Whitney Houston's is probably the most famous. So too, Lady Gaga's performance at the Super Bowl with just a piano is beautiful.
By the dawn's early light.
Album covers are one of the few opportunities for musicians to specifically choose how to connect their music to a visual idea. In many cases, the artwork for an album is almost inseparable from the music itself, and there are many cases of this being controversial. Probably the earliest example is again found with the Beatles. Yesterday and Today was an album cover released in North America and features what's known as the butcher cover, an image of the Beatles holding raw meat and decapitated baby dolls. There is an argument that it's an artistic statement about the image of the Beatles and their relationship with the record industry. Still, it's not my favourite cover they ever made. There have been many covers featuring nudity, including Blind Faith's self-titled album, John and Yoko's full frontal nude photo on Unfinished Music No. 1, and Nirvana's Nevermind cover, featuring a naked baby underwater. The baby in the photo, now an adult of course, filed a lawsuit in 2021 claiming he was exploited in the photo. He lost the case, but I can see his point. He was obviously too young to consent to being on the cover. There are also album covers which are just visually shocking, such as Rage Against the Machine's self-titled album featuring Malcolm Brown's photo of a Buddhist monk protesting the South Vietnamese government. The Rage Against the Machine cover I do find powerful, and given the nature of their music, I think it's fitting. But often I think these are just honestly inappropriate and pointless. Most things on the Iceberg seem to age quite well, and I think we can look back seeing how, despite the controversy, they made a positive impact. I'm not so sure about these album covers. Okay, Ticketmaster. Let's start by giving a bit of lenience to the whole ticketing industry. The advent of the internet essentially took so much money away from record sales that artists had to look for different ways to make money. But not long after, things started going downhill, especially with the merger of Ticketmaster and Live Nation in 2010. This created a monopoly which meant they had significant influence and could have exclusive contracts with the biggest venues. The problem was that many artists, especially major artists, now felt the need to use Ticketmaster. And now, as well as the already much higher ticket prices, customers were hit with convenience fees, service fees, booking fees, you name it, they charge it. Then there's dynamic pricing. This happened with the ticket sales for the Oasis reunion. People would wait hours in line for Oasis tickets, being told they would cost a certain price, and then hours later, when they finally got the chance to buy tickets, Ticketmaster said, oh, actually, it's now hundreds of pounds more expensive. Some artists have challenged Ticketmaster. Pearl Jam tried in the 1990s, even before things got as bad as they are today, but they struggled to book venues without using Ticketmaster. And there's reselling. Buyers who have no intention to see the artist will buy up tickets at market value and then resell for an extortionately higher price. And because digital ticketing means Ticketmaster have much greater control over tickets, if you can't go and need to cancel, you can't just give the ticket to a friend. There's definitely a fairer way of doing this, but there's also an element of what goes around comes around. Years gone by, we would have spent all this money on records, where most of it goes to a record label. Now recordings are essentially free, and we're just spending the same amount of money on tickets, and most of the money is going to Ticketmaster. Speaking of which, let's talk about downloading and streaming. Whilst it's certainly true that the pool of talented musicians making great music is bigger today than ever before, I think it's also true that the golden age of the record industry is in the past. Of course, the catalyst for music becoming essentially free was the internet. 30 years ago, millions of people hearing your music either through radio, TV, or record sales probably would have seen you doing okay. Today, millions of people streaming your music on Spotify likely won't even see you paying the rent. I think there's an argument that it's just a tale as old as time. Nothing lasts forever and the record industry is no different. When the radio came along, songwriters were upset because people wouldn't buy their sheet music anymore. And then when recording took off, people didn't like that either. The American Federation of Musicians famously led a strike in 1942 because recording musicians were receiving lower income from recordings than they were from live broadcasts. Understandably, artists and record labels weren't happy when the internet came along, because people were downloading and they were making less money from record sales. The trouble is how this is being resolved. Early solutions included the iTunes Store, where customers could purchase individual songs instead of having to purchase the whole album. Apple would argue this is a 21st century solution to a 21st century problem, but musicians would argue this diminished the value of a complete album. Not to mention the quality of those early iPod earphones. The sound quality was bad enough, but let's be honest, after a few months you'd be lucky to get both earphones to work without looping and twisting the cable. And then came streaming, which now appears to be the established solution to the problem. It's sort of this halfway house, which is good enough to get us away from file sharing, but it doesn't offer a great experience to anyone. Artists are making more than they did from illegal downloading, but are making almost nothing compared to traditional record sales. And listeners have lost the experience of building a personal music collection which they own, into now just having an overabundance of music which is now a service rather than a product. The solution to all this? I don't know. Spotify will come and one day go, things will change. But it's interesting because even though this isn't the music itself, these technological changes completely redefine how we all listen to music. Some of these controversies offer food for thought, some have serious and meaningful consequences, and some like this one are just spontaneous moments that leave everyone stunned. In September 2009, Taylor Swift had just won Best Female Video at the VMAs for her song You Belong With Me. But But just as she started her acceptance speech, Kanye stormed on stage, took the mic, and made his own speech.
Yo, Taylor, I'm really happy for you. I'm gonna let you finish. But Beyonce had one of the best videos of all time.
Beyonce was left stunned and embarrassed, and Taylor as well clearly had no idea what just happened or what to do next. The crowd booed Kanye, and he faced heavy backlash. President Obama even called him a jackass. Later on in the show, Beyonce actually won Video of the Year for her song Single Ladies, and invited Taylor Swift on stage so she could finish her acceptance speech. The whole "I'ma let you finish" thing became a famous meme and quickly spread around the internet. And although years later Kanye and Taylor would appear to be on good terms, things got heated again when Kanye released a song called Famous, about how that incident made Taylor Swift famous. A video was released of a phone call between them, with Taylor apparently approving the song, but the video was only a short clip from the call, and Taylor insisted that it was taken out of context, and she didn't actually approve the message of the song.
It's because it has a very controversial line at the beginning of the song about you.
What does it say?
Okay.
Kanye, of course, claimed that he did get her permission, but it was only when the full phone call was released finally in 2020 that it became clear he didn't. You might be thinking this is one of the least controversial things Kanye has done, especially in recent years, and that's true. We could spend the whole video just talking about Kanye West. But I don't feel it's right to give added light to those, and also they aren't really music related. This incident is at least related to music, and I also think it's one of those moments that has stuck around in people's memories. Setting aside everything Kanye's done since then and just focusing on this incident, I just find the whole thing a bit icky. I'm not really interested in award shows and celebrity culture, and for what it's worth, I really like much of Kanye's and Taylor's music, but award shows, and especially this kind of drama, it just seems below us. We all know music is a deeply powerful art form, both for us as individuals, but also in its ability to share a message and inspire other people to connect with that message. A great example of using music to protest is the song Strange Fruit, most notably recorded by Billie Holiday. The lyrics originated as a poem called Bitter Fruit, written by Abel Meeropol, and it's one of the most powerful and historically significant songs of the 20th century, offering a haunting depiction of the racial violence in America. Billie Holiday first began performing the song at Cafe Society, New York's first integrated nightclub, and her performance is as powerful as the song itself. In fact, as Billie Holiday sang the song, it was presented in a particularly dramatic way. It would be the last song of her set, the waiters would stop all service during the song, and the room would be in darkness, except for a spotlight on Billie Holiday. Performances of the song were not met with the usual applause, but instead a stunned silence. She approached her label Columbia to record the song, but they turned it down, fearing retaliation. But they did give her a one-release break from her contract if she could find another label to release it, and she did. She recorded the song with the band from Cafe Society, and it was released on Vocalion Records in 1939, and it would go on to be the biggest selling song of her career. But for Billie Holiday, it wasn't all so easy. Many concert venues were reluctant to book her, knowing she would perform the song, and she was investigated by government agencies concerning her drug use, but this may have been to cover up the real concern of the song. This is just one of many examples of protest songs having a powerful impact on society. Everyone from Nina Simone to Bob Dylan to rap groups such as NWA played their part in using music to highlight injustice in society. And it's certainly not unique just to the US. In every corner of the earth, you can find people using music to protest. It's easy to forget, looking back, how difficult it was often for these artists to perform and record this music. As I mentioned earlier, the Beach Boys didn't want to release God Only Knows because using God in the title of a pop song was seen as improper. So to have the courage to record music as powerful as this, knowing the possible retaliation, is very inspiring. When we think of musicians taking drugs, you might think of Elton John, Eric Clapton having a good time, partying hard, and using it to enhance their creativity. They were rich and famous, they've stopped now, it's all good. But these are the exceptions. What about the musicians where it did in fact permanently ruin their career? Take for example Sid Vicious, a heroin addict who was supplied drugs by his own mother. Sid's partner Nancy, also a heroin addict, died aged 20, and Sid died aged 21. Events like this are often portrayed as rock and roll, but in reality, they're tragic. Drug abuse happened all the time in jazz music. Billie Holiday, Charlie Parker, Miles Davis, they battled drugs and alcohol their whole life. And it's common to have a view, because of how the Beatles used drugs to help make great music, that drugs are this amazing creative tool. But for many musicians, it was a struggle. So too for Chet Baker, a beautiful trumpet player and singer. There's one particularly famous incident in which it's believed he was trying to buy drugs. It ended in a fight and his front teeth were knocked out. His career as a singer and trumpeter were ruined, and he spent 3 years working in a gas station and had to relearn how to play the trumpet. And this wasn't a struggling young musician who was just out of school. Records such as Chet Baker Sings were over 10 years old, and at this point he's working in a gas station. It's easy to romanticize drug taking, and as great as it is that Elton John and Eric Clapton finally got clean, I think it can often make it appear that no harm was done and it's all okay. But for many musicians, harm was done. It ruined their career, or even worse, ended their life. At the bottom of the iceberg, things start to get bad enough that we need to question our own involvement as listeners, because it's not just drugs and alcohol that impact musicians, but also our relentless obsession with their personal lives, with the media often sensationalizing whatever they're going through, and photographers and journalists following them and making up stories. Especially today, it seems as though modern pop musicians are as much known for their life away from music than the music itself. A famous example is, of course, Britney Spears. After rising to fame as a pop star in the late 90s, it wasn't long until many of the details of her personal life became even more desirable to the media than anything music related. With the development of the 24/7 news cycle, her every move was followed, and high-profile relationships and breakups only helped to fuel the frenzy surrounding her. Understandably, this was difficult for her to deal with, and when she shaved her head in 2007, she wasn't met with compassion from the media for what she was going through, but instead even further ridicule and gossip. In 2008, she was placed into a conservatorship, with her father overseeing her personal and financial matters. The details of this are not quite known, but it's believed that much of her life was dictated without her consent, giving rise to the Free Britney movement. Either way, when she walks out the front door and there's a photographer, she's not seen as a musician or a singer, but a potential source for an attention-grabbing headline. A similar example is Amy Winehouse. After modest success with her early work, her 2006 album Back to Black sent her into international stardom. But of course, the media didn't focus on her amazing jazz-inspired vocals or beautiful songwriting, but instead her difficult personal life. In particular, her struggle with drugs and alcohol, which led to unflattering photos and sensational headlines, as well as paparazzi constantly outside her home, and sometimes even the treatment centres she was staying at. Again, instead of respecting the serious crisis she was facing, her struggles became something of a spectacle for the media. And the unrelenting pressure likely became an even more powerful source towards her further issues with alcohol, something that she struggled with until her death in 2011. Sadly, we lost one of the most talented and creative musicians of a generation, and given the rise of social media since then, I'm not sure if things have gotten much better. In fact, I think social media only highlights our own responsibility for continuing to engage with this needless obsession. At the bottom of the iceberg, we find our final controversy. Again, a moral dilemma for all of us as listeners. How do we, and how should we, separate the art from the artist? Now, of course, this exists on a spectrum. If it turns out one of my favourite artists has a different opinion on something, which is perfectly fine and legal, I'm not going to stop listening to their music. But then on the other far end of the spectrum are examples such as R. Kelly and Lost Prophets. Now, I'm not even a fan of their music anyway, so it's no loss to me. But there's a whole debate about how famous musicians abuse their influence and power to do these morally awful things. And I think we should probably consider how much we idolise these musicians, when in fact they're of course no better than any of us, and often much worse people. The most famous and probably the most difficult example of this is Michael Jackson. Now, Michael Jackson has never been found guilty of anything, so I'm not saying he did anything wrong, but he was undeniably one of the greatest musicians, singers, dancers, entertainers of the century. I really like so much of his work. But imagine you turn on the news and see this. Can you still listen to his music in the same way? What's interesting about Michael Jackson is that he's one of the few examples where his music is so popular, it's almost impossible to imagine a world where we stop listening to his music. Most of the examples so far include musicians abusing their power, but they also commit more common yet still terrible crimes. Phil Spector, the legendary producer who defined a whole era with his wall of sound, was convicted of murder in 2009. Jim Gordon, a legendary drummer who worked with Phil Spector and appeared on so many songs that we know and love, killed his own mother before being diagnosed with schizophrenia. Does this change the way we listen to this music? These are ultimately questions no one can answer other than ourselves, other than to say we probably shouldn't idolize these musicians as much as we often do.